Good evening, welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight, China is witnessing massive protests against the government's draconian zero COVID policy. Hundreds of protesters demonstrated in cities across the country against China's President Xi Jinping's strategy, with some of them even calling for his removal. Step down Xi Jinping, step down Communist Party is what demonstrators were heard yelling during a protest in the financial hub of Shanghai. According to several news agencies, a deadly fire last week in Urumqi, the capital of northwest China's Xinjiang region, sparked public anger, with many blaming COVID-19 lockdowns to hampering rescue efforts. Soon protests erupted in other Chinese cities as well. According to several reports and videos shared online, students chanted democracy and the rule of law, freedom of expression during demonstrations at Beijing's prestigious Tsinghua University. On the show tonight, China's anti-COVID protests. Are they now a democracy movement?
Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping!
The biggest wave of civil disobedience in mainland China since Xi Jinping assumed power a decade ago, as protests over China's draconian zero COVID policy flare up in several cities. In Beijing, two groups of protesters totaling at least 1,000 people gathered, refusing to disperse as authorities imposed snap lockdowns, lengthy quarantines and mass testing campaigns over a handful of COVID cases. In an unusually bold act that appeared to indicate the level of people's desperation, a crowd in Shanghai called for the removal of the Communist Party and Xi Jinping during a standoff with the police, chanting Xi Jinping, step down. Chinese people usually refrain from criticizing the party and its leaders in public for fear of reprisals. In Wuhan, where the pandemic began 3 years ago, videos on social media showed residents take to the streets, smashing through metal barricades, overturning COVID testing tents, and demanding an end to lockdowns. The Chinese healthcare system is creaking under the mass testing of millions every day, yet experts say lifting restrictions could lead to more than 1 million COVID deaths due to the low vaccination among the elderly. But as China sticks with Xi's zero COVID policy, even as much of the world has lifted restrictions, Chinese stocks fell sharply as investors raised concerns over the impact of the protests on the world's second largest economy. The past few days of protests in China over the zero COVID policy have combined widespread anger over multiple issues in a manner unheard of since Tiananmen Square in 1989. 2 years ago, the zero COVID policy was successful in preserving the freedom of the majority at the cost of the minority of lockdown cities such as Wuhan. Now the country seems much more united in its suffering. Parmeshwar Bava for NDTV.
So these protests now spreading all across China. Joining us now to look at this, Dr. Brahma Chilani. I'm also joined by Andrew K.P. Leung, Victor Gao, Dr. Eric Fiegelding and Dr. Tara Karta. Thank you all very much for being with us. Mr. Victor Gao, let me come to you first. Is this at this stage essentially a pro-democracy movement more than it is a movement directed at the measures which have been taken by the Chinese government to fight against COVID?
Thank you very much for having me. I think the fact that there are multiple protests in different cities in China is very rare to start with, and also it warrants very close analysis by the Chinese government. And the Chinese government authorities really need to act very quickly to get to the bottom of the situation and to address the legitimate concerns of the protesters, but also to emphasize the need for the continuation of the dynamic zero COVID policy to start with. And the goal of this policy is to save as many people in China as possible from deaths of infections and from getting infections themselves. I would say China has really achieved a spectacular success in dealing with the pandemic up to today. But from now on, we also need to be more flexible in normalizing the daily lives of the people, in making the restrictions less hurtful, less inconvenient to the people. Therefore, the public enemy is not one group of people versus the other. The public enemy remains the virus. We need to get united in coming up with more effective, more scientifically oriented ways to deal with the virus. On the basis of huge success China has made over the past 3 years.
I understand what you're saying, but you haven't answered my question. Is this essentially a pro-democracy movement at this stage?
First of all, China calls itself a democracy that works. And if you look at the economic performance over the past 43 years, you cannot say China is not a democracy, because where is the proof? The proof is that we constantly on a daily basis improve the living standards of all of us in China. Now, pro-democracy, it really, you are talking about what you mean.
Now, let me explain what I'm meaning.
I completely disagree with some of the demands.
Let me explain what I'm meaning, since you're asking, and it's a valid question, sir. Pro-democracy in the Western context, or even in the Indian context, where you've got leaders, people in China calling for Xi Jinping to step down, for equal rights, from a freedom from oppression. These are hallmarks of what people across the world would call democratic protests. We've seen this in '89 in China, which led up to the Tiananmen massacre. Is this something like that? It's more widespread.
Absolutely not. First of all, allow me to emphasize one point. If the Chinese nation learned anything from what happened in 1989, it is this, and I hope I will have your ears. That is, China cannot afford to have a revolution. Whatever problems we have, we need to solve the problems through peaceful means. And rioting, chaos, anarchy are not what suits the Chinese circumstances. And therefore, I think we need to put a premium on stability and sustainability of our development.
All right.
The voices raised by some of the protesters are absolutely wrong, because they are not conducive to stability in China. They may lead China to great chaos and anarchy. As a person in China, I strongly oppose those big noises, and I hope they will calm down. And I can assure you, living in Beijing, today Beijing is very quiet. There is no massive amount of protests anymore.
And yet those protesters are not free to come on international media and talk because of the repressive means which China has about people expressing themselves, for example, on Twitter, or even coming on to Zoom conversations. May not apply to you, but the vast majority of people cannot express themselves. So while I take your point completely, sir, because it is your democratic right to state that, look, these people don't represent the true China, one would suggest that they feel very differently.
Well, I would say in China, the way it works is that if you promote stability, then you have maximum freedom to talk about how you want to promote stability. If you want to promote anarchy, you will be silenced. That's the way things work in China. And I would say some of the noises expressed by the protesters in Shanghai in particular are not promoting stability in China.
Okay.
They are leading to great anarchy. We, the majority of the people in China, are opposed to that.
All right, fair enough. I'll come back to you. It's always fascinating talking to you, sir. Dr. Eric Fiegelding, you know, we've spoken how many times over the last many years, and we've spoken about COVID. We've spoken about herd immunity, and we've spoken to a lesser extent on China's strategy. Some would suggest that China's strategy in dealing with COVID hasn't been very effective if you've got 40,000 cases being reported on a daily basis now. But my question to you, Dr. Eric Fiegelding, is this. We've all hated herd immunity because it ends up resulting in the loss of lives. China has fought that by trying to clamp down on people. But we still see COVID resurgent in China, right, in terms of the numbers. So how does one balance this out?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. This is a very tricky question because China right now has record number of cases every day again, but it has to decide, does it want millions of deaths because we remember how many people died last year in India. Do we want hundreds of millions of long COVID, or do we want to stop the virus? And there is unfortunately a huge trade-off, and I empathize with a lot of people in China about this. But there is the mathematical certainty that millions of people will die if you just let the virus rip. That said, China has been relaxing restrictions. It's relaxing international travel. It's relaxing many of the contact tracing. But the issue right now is that, which will destroy the economy more? Having millions of people who die and disrupting other production in hospitals, or having the mitigations? And again, it's not full city lockdowns. It's district by district, neighborhood by neighborhood closures. Is that enough? And the other thing that people have not talked about is China has been mass inoculating with a new generation of vaccines. And I don't mean simply the bivalent vaccines for the new variants. They've been vaccinating with nebulized aerosol vaccines that lines the mucosa and prevents infections and has much higher antibody levels than the first generation of vaccines. They've been using it on a massive scale, and I think China is trying to bet that it could actually reopen and actually reduce infection somewhat with these new generation of vaccines.
Dr. Eric,
that no other country in the world is currently using. Have you changed your opinion?
Eric, have you changed your opinion on herd immunity? I remember talking with you in the past.
No, herd immunity is dangerous. You should not.
Exactly, and yet,
there is no long term.
And yet, in a country like India, that is ultimately what saved the lives of many. And yes, of course, it's resulted in the deaths of many. But the fact of the matter is, in a city like Delhi, where I live, which has seen so many deaths, you now actually have the R factor, the R rate, the rate of reproduction of COVID at negligible numbers. For the moment, it's almost as if it doesn't exist.
Yes, it's
and
low
that's possibly
for the
because we've all had it.
It's for the moment because, for example, India had such a bad wave in March, April, May of 2021. Now, that was the hard way. The issue is that we should not want to achieve that herd immunity through that very, very high price that society had to pay. And we remember what happened last year. Look, I think the issue is there will be new variants. India has so far held back because of this previous mass infection, which should China suffer that same thing to achieve what India currently has? Can it suffer without the high death tolls and the lack of oxygens and all the hospitals running out of oxygens that you remember before? Or can it achieve it without that mass disruption and still allow it to function and have economic productivity?
Okay.
This is the huge trade-off here, and I think China is trying to save lives and have localized disruption, but not mass disruption.
Okay, Andrew K.P. Leung, let me come back to my first question. It's wonderful that Eric has actually spelled out, the health issues over here, but there's the entire issue of rights as well. And do you believe that somewhere this has become perhaps somewhat less about COVID and more about democratic rights, about people saying no to the Chinese government, or people saying that they want equality in the sense which many other democracies, true democracies in the world see that to be? I mean, is that what is now happening in China?
Well, let's look at the facts, because as recently as January 2022, at the beginning of this year, there was a in-depth study by one of the world's most renowned research institutes or company based in New York. It's called Edelman Trust Barometer, EDELMAN, Edelman Trust Barometer. Well, you Google that. It's one of the most respected research companies, and they look around the world to see which government has the most support of its people in response to the pandemic. Amongst all the countries, China came up tops because most of the Chinese people, the vast majority, thought that the government had done a good job. That was January this year. 2022. And as far as the government's performance over the decades are concerned, the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center study, also released last year, also confirmed that the Communist Party government is the most supported by these people around compared with
But then
many.
what has happened in the last few months, sir?
Well, now it's been 3 years since the pandemic has struck, and with all these restrictions, people's patience is beginning to wear thin. This is understandable. And now with the surge of the variants, and let's not compare China with just like any other country. It's a very different country. It's got a fifth of mankind within its borders, and then a lot of vulnerable groups, and the aged group, for example, have a very low vaccination rate of only 40%. And then, of course, most of the population is concentrated in coastal cities. So if you allow China to copy what's happening in the West, there was a danger. The virus would strike at the most vulnerable.
Okay, so half a sec, sir. I just need to go across. Sure, I'll try and come back to you, but I want to go across to my two other panelists because I'm running short on time, as always. Dr. Brahmacharani, I'll ask you that same question. Is this about COVID or is this about rights in China?
Well, first, if we believe China's statistics, then even in comparative terms, we should not forget that a number of wealthy, highly vaccinated countries are still reporting high incidence of COVID cases. The United States, for example, is reporting more than 40,000 new COVID cases daily and about 350 deaths per day. That's pretty high. And the US is not alone. If you look at Europe, look at South Korea, Japan, these wealthy countries are still battling surges of COVID. But China's statistics have always been suspect. The more important thing is this: the protests in China may have been triggered by the harsh COVID-related lockdowns, but they have snowballed into anti-Xi Jinping and anti-Communist Party demonstrations. As you rightly pointed out, that this could be a new democracy movement. One democracy movement was crushed rather brutally in 1989, according to declassified British documents. Some 10,000 people were slaughtered at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Today, what we are seeing is much bigger than what happened in Beijing in 1989, because the Tiananmen Square protests were concentrated in one city, in one part of that city. In fact, now we are seeing protests across China. Now, let's not forget one important thing. Participating in any protest in China takes much courage, as it comes with high personal risk. After all, China has a record of imposing severe punishment on protesters, including handing them long jail sentences. This is the world's most extensive surveillance and police state. In the current protests, many have been arrested by police. The Communist Party will definitely use the country's surveillance system, including facial recognition technology, to identify more participating protesters, and many more will be arrested in the coming days or weeks. Some will simply disappear. Yet, the protests not only continue, but they have spread to most cities. So the protests are remarkable and also unprecedented.
Okay.
They have ominous implications for the future of communist rule in China. Okay. And the surge in COVID cases compounds Xi Jinping's zero-tolerance approach to COVID-19. As we know historically, every virus, as it progresses, becomes less lethal, but more transmissible. So we have seen with the COVID case, with the COVID virus, it's become less lethal. It's killing less number of people, but it's more transmissible.
Okay, Dr. Chilani, half a second. Dr. Tarakarta, do you believe that the protests we are seeing in China now represents a threat to Xi Jinping, or as Dr. Chilani says, do you believe that this is going to be a period, if it isn't already, of the state in China, the security state, taking unprecedented action against millions?
I'm really surprised at what our Chinese participants have said, because there is one thing is state responsibility. towards the citizen of preventing COVID. I get that. But you know what happened at Foxconn, you know, the protests earlier, to shut in an entire community, it just can't be done. It is simply unbelievable, the kind of, you know, the restrictions which have been put. The people in that particular factory, people were locked in because there was a COVID case. That's not what you do for the welfare of your people. One. Number two is, I think it's a very serious protest. It's not just about COVID, it's also about a slowing economy. And that is something China is going to have to address. And number three is that after the recent party congress, what you saw is there is a focus more towards security rather than the economy. I mean, Xi and his advisors, they're talking security all the time. I'm just beginning to wonder, Vishnu, whether, you know, a leader who goes on, a leader or a set of people who go on for a long time begin to lose touch with reality. What is going on the road? And I think that's what's happening here. They haven't got the extent of anger of people, the extent of what it has done to them, you know, on the ground. And that, I'm sorry, but that's what I see in our thing. I mean, no doubt China has done a tremendous job with COVID, though it hasn't vaccinated that many people. But you cannot shut in a human being like this. So I agree with Brahma. I think this is a very, very serious situation, and it's much more than COVID.
Victor Gao, would you like to respond that, yes, I mean, you know, what China has done with COVID, Eric has spoken about the new types of vaccines being used, etc., etc. But the extent to which measures are being taken to lock down homes which are being bolted, people who are being repressed, is it not excessive?
Allow me to make 2 points
very
quickly.
Yes.
First of all, from the Chinese perspective, life or right to life is the most important human right, because without life you lose all the rights you are talking about. And we put a premium on saving lives, and this is exactly the crux of the matter for this dynamic COVID policy. In China, we refuse to accept the herd immunity. We think that's built upon massive amount of people dead, massive amount of people getting infections, and this is not the situation China wants to embrace. So China has put in a heroic struggle for 3 years, and now we still do not want to accept that the herd immunity is the only right way to happen. We want to do something else. We want to use our own technology, our own science, our own resources, and pooling of the resources of everyone involved in China to come up with a better way. And the goal is to make sure, minimize death, minimize infections. In this way, China has achieved a great success. Now, you talk about lockdown. How can you lock down all these people? The lockdown is if in your community, in your building, there is a positive case, then you are advised to stay at home. You do not venture out. Now it's for 5 days or 4 days or 3 days. Meaning you need to take test every day, and if you are tested negative in 3 days' time, you can leave home to go to other places. If you test positive, then you need to be cured, and you do not infect other people in your family or in your building or in your community. I think this policy needs to be revised again and again to become more human, of course, but also to be more effective, more targeted. Allow me to emphasize once again, the right to life in China is considered as the most important human right. And if anyone disagrees with me, then we are not on the same page.
No, I think
if you put a premium to life,
everybody can
then
accept
you will share a lot
that
of things
the right to life is the most important. That's the center of our humanity. But I think it's how one goes about ensuring that that is the case. Now, I'm interrupting you only because I'm out of time, and also because I think it's important that we listen in on what the Chinese government spokesperson had to say earlier on today.
有了中国共产党的领导，有了全体中国人民的配合和支持，中国的抗疫一定会成功。中方一贯欢迎外国记者依法依规在华采访报道，并为此提供了大量协助和便利。 与此同时，外国记者在华采访报道期间，应该自觉遵守中国法律法规。
All right, well, that situation in China is absolutely critical. These protests have now spread all across the country. There are so many conversations and protests taking place about repression, about people saying that Xi Jinping has to go, about the need for true democracy. More than anything else, they want their freedom. They don't want to be repressed. But the fact of the matter is there is a COVID crisis in China, but is this really the way it needs to be dealt with? We'll take a short break, come back with more.